Welcome back to Sleepy Science History. I hope you're tucked in, warm and comfortable, maybe with the gentle hum of the night around you. Tonight, we'll wander into a world you've walked past 1,000 times without truly hearing. The quiet, hidden conversations of trees. It's a story of whispers beneath the soil, of friendships older than human memory, and a network more intricate than the internet. So close your eyes, slow your breathing, and let the forest speak to you. By the end, you might never look at a tree the same way again. The forest has something to say. Have you ever stood in a forest and felt watched? Not in a scary way, not like someone's hiding behind the trees, but in that deep, almost ancient way, as if the forest itself noticed you. What if I told you that, in a way, it does? You see, trees aren't the silent, lonely pillars we often imagine. They have their own ways of speaking, their own lines of connection. And I wonder, how many centuries have they been whispering while we walked past without hearing a word? Scientists have a name for their hidden network, the Wood Wide Web. It's a funny name, isn't it? Makes you picture a pine tree typing away at a keyboard, sending a polite message to a maple. Dear neighbor, caterpillars are heading your way. You might want to prepare. But of course, the truth is far more beautiful. Instead of cables, they use threads of fungi, so fine you could line a dozen across a single hair. And here's where I have to pause, because don't you find it strange, almost magical, that the very ground we walk on is laced with invisible threads carrying messages between trees? We think of forests as still. Yet under the soil, there's movement, a slow, deliberate conversation in chemistry and sugar and scent. Through these fungal filaments, mycorrhizal networks, trees share more than just gossip. They share life itself. Water, nutrients, warnings, comfort. There are even mother trees, the elders of the forest, feeding their seedlings and sometimes helping weaker neighbors survive. Can you imagine that? A great old cedar quietly pushing some of her hard-earned sugars toward a struggling young fir? And not for profit, not for gain, just because. It makes me wonder, when did humans decide that survival had to be competitive? Because the forest, left to its own devices, tells a different story, one of cooperation, of connection, a story that's been unfolding for hundreds of millions of years, long before the first human carved words into stone. If we could shrink ourselves down and travel through the soil like explorers, what would we see? We'd move past twisting roots, each one a little different, some as thick as your arm, others fine as thread. Between them, the pale strands of fungus would stretch like an underground lacework, branching and rebranching until you'd lose track of where one thread ends and another begins. Everywhere you turned, there'd be tiny exchanges, water flowing one way, sugars another, chemical signals like tiny envelopes being passed from hand to hand. And I suppose I should mention this is not some poetic guesswork. We know it happens. Scientists have traced carbon isotopes moving from one tree to another. They've seen how a birch will feed a fir in summer, and then the fir will return the favor in winter. Doesn't that sound almost polite? Like neighbors trading cups of sugar over a garden fence? Sometimes the messages are urgent. If one tree is attacked by insects, it sends a warning, through the fungal network or sometimes through the air, that causes other trees to boost their defenses before the pests arrive. It's a little like a friend texting you to say, hey, there's traffic on your route. Leave early. Only here, the message might be, leaf-chewing beetles incoming. Prepare your chemical arsenal. I like to imagine that if you could stand very still, press your hand to a tree trunk, and listen long enough, you might feel the faintest echo of those alerts, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. And maybe that's the point. The forest operates on a different timescale than we do. We rush, we schedule, we count minutes. Trees don't. Their conversations might take hours, days, even seasons. Can you imagine speaking so slowly that your reply to a question might come next spring? What would that do to the way we think, or the way we value words? I remember once, walking in an old-growth grove, feeling that strange blend of stillness and life. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of cedar and moss. I found myself wondering, was I breathing in molecules exhaled by these very trees centuries ago? Was the oxygen in my lungs part of some long-forgotten conversation between the canopy and the soil? And here's another thought. Do you think they notice us? Not in the way we notice each other, with faces and names, but in the quiet way they notice changes in the air, in the ground vibrations. Maybe they register our footsteps as just another event in the long rhythm of their lives. We're guests here, after all, walking through a living network far older and wiser than we can comprehend. Which brings me to a question I can't stop turning over in my mind. If this network is so vital, if it's the forest's nervous system, what happens when we cut it? When we remove a tree, we're not just taking away a single life. We're breaking threads, silencing connections. What ripples out from that silence? Who notices? Who goes hungry? And doesn't it change the way we think about conservation? Planting a tree is good, wonderful, even, but if it stands alone, without the network, it's like giving someone a phone with no signal. The magic of a forest lies not in its individual trees, but in the invisible lines between them. I sometimes think of it like a tapestry. You can admire each thread on its own, the color, the texture, but the meaning, the image, the beauty, comes from how those threads weave together. The forest's conversations are the weaving. Without them, all we have are lonely strands. So perhaps, next time you find yourself under a canopy of leaves, you might slow down. Breathe. Feel the hum of life underfoot. You might not hear the words, but maybe you'll sense the presence of a language that's been here long before you, and will, I hope, be here long after. And I suppose that's the invitation of this journey we're beginning together. To lean in, to listen, and to wonder, what are the trees saying today? The underground conversations. If the forest has a voice, where exactly does it speak from? Is it in the rustle of leaves overhead? The groan of a trunk in the wind? Or could it be that the real conversations happen somewhere we never think to look, beneath our feet? I find myself wondering about that often, because what's under the forest floor is more than just dirt, more than roots. It's a hidden city, a place where trees, fungi, and countless tiny creatures trade information the way we might trade stories at a cafe. Have you ever imagined what it would look like if the ground turned to glass for a moment? Would you see a tangle of roots like highways winding under the soil? Would you notice the fine, pale threads running between them like silver spiderwebs? Those threads are called mycorrhizal fungi, and they're the messengers of the forest. The name sounds a little technical, I know. Myco means fungus, rhiza means root, but all it really means is a partnership, a handshake that never ends. Trees offer the fungi sugars they make from sunlight. Fungi offer the trees nutrients from the soil, phosphorus, nitrogen, and other things they can't easily reach on their own. A simple trade. But what if I told you it's more than a trade? What if it's the backbone of an entire communication system? These fungal threads, or hyphae, connect not just one tree to its fungi, but many trees to one another. Through them, trees can pass water, nutrients, and even chemical messages. And here's the part one love. Sometimes those messages are warnings. Imagine one tree under attack from hungry insects. Before the pests even move on, that tree sends a chemical alert through the fungal network. Its neighbors pick up the message and boost their own defenses. It's like a neighborhood watch, only instead of porch lights and walkie-talkies, it's chemistry and underground threads. Do you think the trees know who they're sending messages to? Science suggests they do. In some studies, mother trees, the largest, oldest ones, sent more resources to their own seedlings than to strangers. It's as if they recognized their own family in the darkness of the soil. How? We're still figuring that out. But doesn't it make you wonder how much more is going on under our feet than we've guessed? Picture yourself walking in a forest now. Every step you take might press down on dozens, maybe hundreds of fungal strands, delicate cables carrying news from one root to another. And here's the thing, you wouldn't feel a thing. It's all so quiet, so patient. A signal that might take minutes, hours, or even days to travel. Would you have the patience to hold a conversation at that speed? I sometimes think about how different our world would be if humans communicated like trees. Would arguments even exist if we had to wait until next week to respond? Would kindness become our default, simply because we had so much time to think before we acted? And yet, even in their slowness, forests are efficient. If a young sapling is trapped in the shade, unable to make enough sugar. Nearby trees may feed it through the network until it's strong enough to grow taller. Why do they do this? Is it strategy to ensure the forest's survival as a whole? Or is it simply the way life here works? You give when you have more, you receive when you have less. Sometimes, these exchanges even happen between different species. A Douglas fir might share with a paper birch, and later the birch might return the favor. Two very different trees, speaking the same chemical language. Doesn't that sound a little diplomatic? And yet, this whole system, this intricate underground telephone line, is invisible to us. We walk on it. We cut into it when we build roads or clear land. And when we sever it, do we realize what we've done? It's not just a root we've broken. It's a sentence cut mid-speech. A message that will never arrive. This is why scientists talk about the importance of preserving old-growth forests. Because these ancient trees are the hubs, the elders, the central nodes of the wood wide web. When they fall, their absence isn't just physical. It's informational. A younger forest can regrow its trunks and leaves much faster than it can rebuild these deep, intricate underground connections. In some ways, it's like losing a library. You can replace the building, but the books are gone. It makes me think, when was the last time you walked in the same forest twice, months or years apart? Did it feel the same? Or did it seem quieter somehow, even if you couldn't say why? Maybe that's not just in your head. Maybe it's the network adjusting to a missing voice. And here's something else to consider. These fungal networks don't just serve the trees. The fungi benefit too. The sugars they receive are their lifeline. They can't make food themselves. Without the trees, they die. So maybe this isn't charity. Maybe it's mutual reliance. Or maybe, in the long story of evolution, those two things aren't so different after all. If you lean close to the forest floor right now, close enough that you can smell the damp, earthy air, you might notice tiny movements. A beetle tunneling, a worm easing through the soil, the quiet stretching of a root tip searching for water. It's all part of the same network. A web not just of fungi and trees, but of life itself. The forest's voice isn't one voice. It's a chorus. And so I leave you with this thought. If a forest can weave its members together into a single, connected whole, why can't we? What might our world look like if we lived as the trees do, rooted in place yet always reaching for each other? Would we speak less, but say more? Would we share more freely, knowing that our own survival was tied to the survival of others? The next time you walk in the woods, take a slow step, then another. Let yourself imagine the silent pathways under your feet. You might not hear them, you might not see them, but they are there, passing messages in a language older than our species, and perhaps wiser too. The voices in the air. If a tree can speak underground, could it also speak above the ground? Not with leaves waving hello or branches pointing the way, but with something far less visible? What would it sound like if we could somehow tune our ears to the right frequency? Or what if the voice of a tree isn't sound at all? This is where it gets fascinating. Because while the wood wide web runs through the soil, trees also have another language, one carried on the breeze. And you've breathed it in before. You just didn't know you were reading a message. Let's take a summer day. The air is warm, the light golden, and somewhere nearby, a caterpillar has started chewing on the tender green leaves of a willow. Now, if you were the willow, how would you respond? Would you wait for the damage to spread? Or would you send a warning? Trees can release special airborne chemicals called volatile organic compounds. They sound like something you'd see listed on a cleaning product, but here they're messages, tiny molecules drifting through the air to nearby trees. The willow's neighbors smell this chemical alarm and, within hours, begin producing bitter-tasting compounds in their leaves. Why? So when the caterpillars arrive, they find the buffet far less appetizing. It's like adding a sudden splash of chili oil to the salad bar. And I can't help but wonder, do you think these trees know they're helping one another? Or is it simply a byproduct of survival honed by millions of years? Does intention even matter if the result is cooperation? The more we look, the more ways we find trees talking above the ground. Some use scent not to warn of danger, but to ask for help. Imagine a pine tree under attack from bark beetles. It releases a particular chemical blend that attracts predators, tiny wasps, that lay eggs in the beetles. The wasps don't come out of kindness. They're looking for a good home for their larvae. But the pine gets protection. Do you see the pattern? The forest is full of deals, alliances, and exchanges. It's a marketplace of scents. And yet, the human nose catches only a fraction of this chemical chatter. If we could smell it all, walking through a forest might feel like strolling through a spice market in slow motion. The air rich with pine resin here, a sharp warning note of oak tannins there, the faint sweetness of flowers calling to bees. Every breath a paragraph in an invisible book. Have you ever noticed how the smell of a forest changes after rain? It's not just the scent of wet earth. It's the amplified voice of the soil and leaves, the damp air carrying molecules farther. Rain is like punctuation in the forest's language, a comma that invites you to pause, a semicolon that connects what came before to what comes next. And I sometimes think, perhaps the forest isn't speaking only to itself. We are animals, after all, with noses and lungs. When we breathe and phytoncides, those same plant-release chemicals, it can lower our stress levels, slow our heart rate, even improve our immune function. Could it be that the forest, in speaking to itself, also ends up speaking to us? Not with meaning, perhaps, but with effect. Almost as if we've been accidental eavesdroppers all along. Consider the seasonal changes. A tree doesn't just drop its leaves because it's cold. It senses day length, temperature, and moisture, then releases signals, inside its own tissues and into the surrounding air, that prepare not only itself, but sometimes its neighbors, for the shift. In autumn, entire stands of deciduous trees seem to move in synchrony, colors shifting together as if the forest has decided, collectively, it's time to rest now. Do you think that's coincidence? Or consensus? And here's something to imagine. If each molecule in the air carried a message, what would the forest be saying on a bright spring morning? Would it be a chorus of greetings, rich with pollen and promise? Would there be quiet check-ins? I have enough water. The frost passed without harm. The bees are returning. We can only guess. But the more I learn, the more I believe that silence, in a forest, is an illusion. There are even some studies suggesting that plants can detect the vibrations of sound. Peas growing toward the sound of running water. Flowers opening more quickly in response to pollinator wing beats. It makes me wonder, if a plant can sense sound, could a tree somehow hear the rustle of another tree in distress? Could the forest have a form of auditory awareness, as slow and subtle as its chemical speech? Of course, there's no proof yet that trees hold conversations the way we do. But then, I think of this, a lack of proof doesn't mean a lack of reality. For centuries, we didn't know about the underground fungal networks. We couldn't see them. Now they're undeniable. So who's to say what the next hidden layer might be? The canopy itself is part of this above-ground exchange. Leaves casting shade affect the microclimate beneath them, altering humidity, light, and temperature for the understory. Those changes influence which plants can grow, which insects thrive, and even which fungi flourish underground. In this way, the very posture of a tree, how it spreads its branches, is part of its language. A language written in light and shadow. Sometimes I think about the first people who must have noticed these things, not in a lab but while living among the trees. Indigenous cultures around the world have long spoken of the forest as alive, communicative, aware. Science is only now beginning to catch up to what those traditions have said for centuries. Isn't it humbling to realize that modern research is confirming what storytellers and elders already knew? And so, when I walk through a forest now, I try to breathe a little deeper. To imagine that with every inhale, I'm borrowing a sentence from the forest's ongoing conversation. That somewhere, a maple's warning, a pine's invitation, or a cedar's sigh is weaving itself into the air around me. We may never translate these messages perfectly, but perhaps we don't have to. Perhaps it's enough to listen, to notice, to acknowledge. You are speaking and I am here. So the next time you step beneath the trees, ask yourself, what's in the air right now? Is it a greeting? A warning? A reminder that life here is interconnected in ways we can't fully see. And if you breathe deeply enough, Could you carry a little of that message with you when you leave? Because if there's one thing the secret language of trees has taught me, it's that communication isn't always about words. Sometimes it's about presence, about being part of the same air, even for a moment. The memory of trees. How does a tree remember? It doesn't have a brain. No neurons, no hippocampus, no dusty filing cabinets in the mind. And yet, some trees hold on to the story of a drought for decades. Others keep a chemical note about an insect attack, ready to pass it on. So what does memory look like when you can't store it in your head? Perhaps it's written in the wood itself. Each ring a chapter. Have you ever seen the cross-section of a log? Those pale and dark bands, circling in neat, tight lines? They're not just pretty patterns for coffee tables. They're a diary year by year, event by event. A wide ring might tell of a wet, generous summer. A narrow ring might whisper of scarcity, of a year when the rain forgot to come. Could you read a life by running your finger over those rings? And memory isn't just trapped in wood. Trees store chemical memories in their tissues, information that changes the way they respond to future events. If a young tree survives a dry season, it may alter the way it uses water for years afterward. It's like a person who lived through a tough winter, always keeping an extra blanket in the cupboard, just in case. Here's something even more remarkable. Trees can share those memories. Through their underground fungal networks, they can pass on chemical signals that teach neighboring trees what's coming. Scientists have observed seedlings that were warned about drought adapting faster when the dry spell arrived, compared to seedlings with no such connection. So is the forest a library, with each tree contributing its own chapter? If so, who decides what gets shared and who just listens? Time itself feels different for a tree. You and I measure life in hours, days, maybe decades. But for a tree, especially an old one, a year might feel like a single breath. What does it mean to grow so slowly that you measure your progress in millimeters? Would patience still feel like patience? Or would it simply be living? And if time moves differently for them, how does that change the way they speak? We rush our conversations, sometimes squeezing a dozen ideas into a single minute. A tree might take an entire season to send one clear message. Would we still talk to each other if our replies took months? Would the words we chose matter more or less? Think about seasons. Trees are experts in timing, not by counting hours, but by reading cues in the environment. The lengthening daylight in spring nudges buds awake. A slow drop in temperature tells leaves it's time to let go. There's choreography without a conductor. Yet somehow, an entire forest moves in step. How do they know? Is there a single tree that acts first, the pioneer, the early riser that others follow? Or do they all, somehow, just feel it at once? Some scientists believe that trees keep a kind of internal clock, a circannual rhythm, built into their cells. Like us, they can sense photoperiods, the changing length of day and night. They don't own watches, but they have pigments like phytochrome, tiny molecular light sensors that track the shifting sun. In a way, each leaf is a little timepiece, ticking in green. And here's where it gets even more curious. Trees can remember damage from years ago and respond faster if it happens again. A tree attacked by certain insects will prime its defenses, keeping its chemical warning system on standby. It's the plant version of learning from experience. Does that mean, in its own way, the tree has a past? And if it has a past, does it also imagine a future? We'll never know for sure. But when I walk through a grove of old oaks, I can't help thinking. Some of these have stood for centuries. They've lived through wars, storms, droughts, fires. They've seen generations of animals come and go. They've felt the footsteps of people long gone, whose names we no longer remember. Does the tree remember the exact moment of each event? Or are all those years simply part of its rings now, indistinguishable from one another? And if you stood beside a tree that's 500 years old, would it look at you, as much as a tree can look, and think of you as just a passing moment? To a tree, your lifetime might feel like a single season, a flash of warm light and then you're gone. Which makes me wonder, maybe that's why forests seem so calm. They're not ignoring us. They just measure life on a scale so large our rushing barely registers. There's something humbling in that thought. We worry about minutes and deadlines. They work in decades and centuries. We talk about saving time. They just are time. This memory, this patience, also plays a role in how forests heal. After a disturbance, like a fire, the surviving trees and their networks can guide regrowth. Roots and fungi help new seedlings find nutrients. Older trees may shade the young from harsh sunlight. The forest remembers what worked before, and it applies that memory again. Is that wisdom, or just the natural outcome of a connected system? Maybe wisdom is just memory, shared generously. And here's the thing, these memories aren't perfect. Sometimes they make a forest more vulnerable. A stand of trees adapted to long, snowy winters might struggle if those winters vanish in a changing climate. It's as if they've studied the same weather textbook for generations, only to find the questions on the test have all changed. Will they adapt in time? Or will the library of the forest have to be rewritten page by page through painful trial and error? I find myself thinking about how human memory works, how we pass down stories, how we decide what matters enough to record. Trees don't write in books, but they do leave records. In rings, in chemistry, in the living tissue of their connections. Maybe we're not so different after all. Both of us are just trying to make sense of the world, to hold on to what matters, and to give the next generation a better chance. And if you stand in a forest now, really stand there, still and quiet, you might feel that sense of continuity. The young saplings around you are not starting from nothing. They've inherited a memory from the giants nearby. The forest is not a collection of individuals. It's an unbroken thread, winding back through time. So the next time you pass an old tree, maybe pause. Run your hand along the bark. You're not just touching wood, you're touching a living archive. One that remembers more than you could in 100 lifetimes. One that will keep remembering, long after you and I have gone. And maybe that's the real lesson of the forest's memory. Not everything has to be rushed. Some things, like wisdom, are worth growing slowly. Conversations with wings and paws. If trees can speak to each other, could they also speak to animals? Not just as shelter or shade or a place to perch, but as actual partners in an ongoing conversation. And if so, what would they say? It's easy to think of trees as solitary storytellers, sharing their tales only with other trees through roots and fungi. But the truth is, their audience is much wider. Birds, squirrels, insects, even us, we're all part of the dialogue. The forest, it turns out, doesn't just whisper underground or send scents on the breeze. It negotiates, it trades, and sometimes it persuades. Have you ever noticed how a fruit ripens? It's green for weeks, stubbornly withholding its sweetness. And then, suddenly, one day, it's ripe and inviting. That's not chance. That's timing. The tree is waiting until the seeds inside are ready for their journey. The bright color, the sweet taste, the fragrance, those are messages. Not for us, though we've learned to enjoy them, but for birds and mammals. Come take this, the tree is saying. Carry my seeds somewhere new. And in return for the meal, the animal spreads the tree's offspring far and wide. It's a clever arrangement, isn't it? Do you think the bird realizes it's part of the plan? Or is it simply enjoying a snack, unaware that it's also a courier? And fruit isn't the only invitation trees send. Some produce nuts so rich in fat that squirrels, jays, or even bears will go to great lengths to gather them. Of course, many of these seeds are eaten on the spot, but some are buried for later and forgotten. From the tree's perspective, that's a success, a seed planted without lifting a root. Could it be that trees count on the forgetfulness of squirrels the way we count on the post to deliver a letter? Pollination is another chapter in this cross-species correspondence. While many plants rely on wind to carry pollen, countless trees have evolved to enlist insects or birds for the job. Bees, butterflies, hummingbirds. They're all drawn in by color, nectar, and scent. But here's the thing, those flowers aren't just pretty. They're billboards, glowing with ultraviolet patterns we can't even see. Each one advertising, pollen here, nectar available, bring friends. I sometimes wonder if we could see in the ultraviolet spectrum, would forests look like neon-lit cities to us? Would we notice the hidden signs, the bright arrows and glowing dots guiding pollinators from bloom to bloom? And the messages go both ways. When pollinators are scarce, Some trees will produce fewer flowers, saving energy. When pollinators are abundant, they might bloom more profusely. It's a conversation in supply and demand, played out in petals and pollen. Of course, not every visitor is a friend. Some animals come not to help, but to take. Leaf-eating caterpillars, bark-stripping deer. And here the tree's language shifts again. It might send chemical signals into its own leaves to make them bitter or tough, deterring the munchers. Or, in some cases, it releases scents that call in the predators of its pests, a kind of botanical help-wanted ad. Isn't it strange to think that a tree can summon an army without moving an inch? And yet, not all grazers are enemies. Elephants in Africa, for example, may damage certain trees by stripping bark, but they also open up the landscape, creating sunny spaces where seedlings of other species can grow. The tree loses something, but the forest as a whole gains diversity. Could it be that, on some level, the forest accepts these losses as part of its balance? There's also the question of warning signals. We've already talked about trees sending chemical alerts to other trees, but some of those same scents may also be picked up by animals. A plant under stress might smell different, not to us, but to an insect that's tuned to those cues. Do you think a deer ever decides to avoid a patch of leaves because the trees have told it, in scent, "I'm not worth eating right now"? We don't know for certain, but the possibility adds yet another layer to this complex conversation. And what about us? We've been part of this exchange for thousands of years. We plant trees where we want them. We spread their seeds intentionally, or sometimes without meaning to. We prune, water, protect, and in return we get shade, food, building materials, oxygen itself. Is that a form of communication too? Are we, in some small way, part of the forest's survival strategy? Consider this. Some fruit trees seem almost designed for human tastes. Apples, peaches, cherries. We've carried them across continents, planting them in places their wild ancestors never dreamed of. We've expanded their range beyond what they could achieve alone. It's a partnership so old we no longer question it. But when you hold an apple in your hand, aren't you also holding the result of an agreement between species? And it goes deeper still. In certain cultures, people have planted groves for ceremonial purposes or to honor ancestors. These groves have been protected for centuries, sometimes becoming the last remnants of ancient forests in a region. So perhaps the language of trees isn't just in chemicals and colors. It's in the bonds they form with us, in rituals and traditions that ensure their voices aren't lost. Sometimes I think about a specific oak I know, a great sprawling thing in a meadow not far from here. Every autumn, it drops a carpet of acorns, and the place becomes a feast. Blue jays swoop in, their calls sharp and bright. Squirrels dart between the roots, stuffing their cheeks. Deer come at dusk, stepping softly. And I wonder, does the oak, in some quiet way, notice this annual gathering? Does it know that these animals are helping to spread its seeds? Or is it simply following its own ancient cycle, trusting that others will play their part? Either way, the result is the same. The oak's offspring find new ground. The meadow's life is renewed, and the conversation continues. So the next time you see a bird eating berries, or a bee diving into a flower, pause for a moment. You're not just watching an animal feed, you're witnessing a deal being made, an exchange that benefits both parties. And somewhere in that exchange, the forest is speaking. Perhaps the most important thing to remember is this. The secret language of trees isn't limited to tree-to-tree talk. It's a network of relationships, stretching beyond species, beyond kingdoms, beyond the boundaries we like to draw in biology books. It's the hum of life working together, each voice shaping the chorus. And maybe, just maybe, when you walk through a forest, the birdsong you hear, the squirrel chatter, even the buzz of insects, are all part of the same sentence. A sentence the forest has been composing for millions of years. When trees disagree. We've spent so much time talking about trees as cooperative beings, feeding each other, warning each other, sheltering each other, that it's tempting to imagine the forest as a perfect utopia. But is that really true? Can any community, no matter how ancient, be free of competition? If you look closely, you'll see another side to the story. Trees may be generous, yes, but they're also ambitious. Every trunk reaching upward is in a quiet race for sunlight. Every root stretching outward is searching for the same nutrients and water. So how do they decide when to share and when to keep for themselves? It's a curious question, isn't it? Can you imagine giving freely to your neighbor one day and then quietly elbowing them aside the next? Yet in the forest, this is simply how life works. Let's start with light, the most precious currency of all. In a dense forest, the canopy is a jigsaw puzzle of overlapping leaves. Each tree spreads its branches to catch the sun, sometimes growing at awkward angles, bending and twisting to find a gap. Have you ever noticed how some trees lean dramatically, almost as if they're listening to something far away? They're listening to the light. It's not an act of malice, it's survival. And yet, this competition shapes the forest's architecture. Shade-tolerant species can survive in the dim light beneath taller neighbors, biding their time for decades until a space opens above. Others grow fast and tall, sacrificing sturdiness for speed, hoping to grab sunlight before their rivals. Do you think they know they're in a race? Or is it simply instinct written into their cells? Below the ground, competition can be even more intense. Roots extend far beyond the shadow of a tree's crown, sometimes 2 to 4 times farther, searching for pockets of water and nutrients. When roots of the same species meet, they often intertwine through the fungal network, trading resources. But when roots from different species cross paths, the story can change. Some trees release chemicals into the soil to slow the growth of their competitors' roots. It's called allelopathy, a kind of chemical no trespassing sign. Isn't it strange to think that a tree can be both a nurturing neighbor and a territorial landowner? And here's something else. Not all partnerships are perfectly fair. In the underground fungal web, some trees act more like hoarders than sharers. They take nutrients but give little in return. Scientists have even found cases where larger, healthier trees draw resources away from weaker ones during times of stress, prioritizing their own survival. We might call that selfish, but in nature, is it selfishness or just strategy? Think of a drought. If you were a tree with limited water, would you risk giving it away, knowing it might cost you your life? Or would you hold on to it, hoping to make it through until the rains return? The forest is full of such quiet decisions made without minds, yet shaping who thrives and who fades. And yet, even in competition, there's balance. When one tree falls, the gap in the canopy becomes a gift to others. Sunlight pours down where it couldn't before, awakening seeds that have waited years in the soil. Nutrients locked in the fallen trunk return to the earth, feeding those still standing. It's as if every loss eventually becomes an offering, whether intended or not. Do you think the forest plans for this? Or is it simply the way life recycles itself, endlessly adapting? There's also the matter of timing. Some trees produce seeds at the same time each year, saturating the forest floor with so many seedlings that predators can't possibly eat them all. Others stagger their seed production, taking advantage of years when conditions are just right, sometimes waiting decades between big seed events. From one perspective, these are acts of cunning strategy. From another, they're acts of pure chance. Which do you believe? And let's not forget that competition shapes beauty. 2. The graceful spacing of trunks, the way branches weave together without touching too much. That's the result of a constant, slow negotiation over space and resources. Sometimes I wonder if the beauty we see is just the visible outline of an invisible tug-of-war. It's also worth noting that competition can lead to innovation. Species adapt to fill different niches. Some thrive in shade, others in full sun. Some develop deeper roots to avoid clashing with shallow-rooted neighbors. In this way, rivalry keeps the forest diverse, ensuring that no single species dominates entirely. Do you think, then, that a little competition is necessary for the forest's health? Of course, the line between competition and cooperation is often blurred. Two trees may fight for sunlight while still sharing nutrients underground. A dominant canopy species might shade out rivals while also protecting them from harsh winds. Perhaps that's the forest's greatest lesson. Relationships aren't simple. They're a constant shifting between giving and taking, helping and holding back. I sometimes think about what it would mean if humans operated this way, If we could compete fiercely in one arena while still caring for each other in another, would that make us more balanced? Or would we find it confusing? The forest seems to manage just fine. Even disturbances, storms, fires, pests, play a role in this balance. A storm might topple one species, giving another a chance to expand. A pest might weaken a dominant tree, allowing diversity to flourish. In this sense, competition and cooperation aren't opposites. They're part of the same cycle. One cannot exist without the other. So perhaps the secret isn't in choosing one over the other, but in knowing when to switch between them, when to reach out and when to pull back, when to share the sunlight and when to chase it. Next time you walk through a forest, notice the spaces between trees. Look at how they reach upward, each in its own way. Ask yourself, are they competing, collaborating, or both all at once? And if they can do both, maybe so can we. Because in the forest, even disagreement is part of the conversation. It's not an ending. It's just another way of speaking. How the forest heals. What happens when the forest is broken? When the wind howls, the ground shakes, or fire sweeps through. Does the conversation stop? Or does it change, soften, deepen, take on a tone of urgency? I've walked through a forest just days after a storm, and it's not the same as before. The air is different, charged, unsettled, yet strangely determined. Branches lie scattered, leaves are torn, trunks have fallen. And you might think, looking at the damage, this will never recover. But the forest has other ideas. It begins quietly. No grand speeches, no sudden regrowth. The surviving trees send signals through the fungal network, passing nutrients to injured neighbors, sharing resources with saplings now exposed to the sun. Do you think they sense the change? That a gap in the canopy means opportunity as well as loss? In the first weeks after a disturbance, the forest's communication network becomes a lifeline. Roots that once traded evenly now shift their priorities, sending water to where it's most needed, feeding seedlings that might otherwise fail. Even fungi adjust, changing their connections to support the most promising plants. It's triage, but in slow motion. Have you ever noticed how quickly new life appears after destruction? In a burned woodland, fresh shoots push through the ash in weeks. Fireweed blooms where there was only smoke. Some trees, like lodgepole pines, even require fire to open their cones and release seeds. It makes you wonder, does the forest keep a plan B tucked away for such moments? Or is this resilience simply built into its nature? Recovery isn't only physical, it's informational. Trees that survive carry a memory of the event, stored in their wood and chemistry. They may alter their growth patterns, strengthen their defenses, or change the way they allocate energy. And through the underground network, those lessons can be passed on. A sapling connected to a storm-scarred elder may grow with a sturdier trunk or deeper roots. Is that teaching? Or is it simply sharing what's necessary for survival? I once read about forests that regrew after volcanic eruptions, where ash had buried everything in sight. At first, it seemed impossible, gray, lifeless expanses stretching for miles. But slowly, seeds blown in by the wind found pockets of soil. Birds and animals brought more. And beneath the ash, some root systems had survived, waiting for the right moment to reach upward again. Took decades, but the forest returned. Do you think it was the same forest as before? Or something entirely new, carrying only a memory of what came before? Insects play their part in healing too. Beetles, often seen as destroyers, help break down fallen wood, returning nutrients to the soil. Fungi and bacteria work alongside them, dismantling the old to make room for the new. It's a reminder that in the forest, even decay has purpose. Could it be that nothing is truly wasted here? Sometimes, healing begins before the damage is done. In drought-prone areas, trees share water through their roots, keeping each other alive long enough for rains to return. In pest outbreaks, early warnings help neighbors fortify themselves before the insects spread. It's a kind of preventative care, like the forest is always keeping one eye on the horizon. And then there are the pioneer species, the first plants to grow after a disturbance. They're often hardy, fast-growing, and unafraid of harsh conditions. They stabilize the soil, shade the ground, and pave the way for more delicate species to return. It's almost as if they volunteer for the hardest job, knowing they won't be the final residents. Why do they do it? Perhaps because in the forest story, every role matters, even the temporary ones. Healing can take years, even centuries. An old-growth forest lost to logging may never return exactly as it was. The intricate networks, the subtle balances, these are built over lifetimes. But new forests still form, new connections still grow. Do you think the forest mourns what's gone? Or does it simply adapt, weaving the new into the old? Humans have a complicated relationship with this process. Sometimes we speed recovery, planting saplings, restoring wetlands, removing invasive species. Other times we disrupt it, clearing land before it can regrow, breaking apart networks before they can repair themselves. When we help, are we part of the forest's healing process? Or are we just trying to fix what we've broken? One thing is certain, the forest heals best when we give it space. Left alone, nature has a way of finding balance again. Not the same as before, never exactly the same, but whole in its own way. Perhaps that's the lesson for us, too. Healing doesn't always mean going back to what was. Sometimes it means growing into something new. I've often thought about how healing in the forest mirrors healing in our own lives. We suffer losses. We face storms. And at first, it feels like the damage is too great. But slowly, connections reform. We draw strength from those around us. We change, adapt, and carry the memory of what happened forward. We're never exactly who we were. But maybe that's not a bad thing. So the next time you walk through a forest, look for the signs of recovery. A fallen tree feeding 100 tiny plants. A patch of wildflowers where sunlight now pours in. The green fuzz of moss reclaiming a charred log. All these are proof that life is always leaning toward repair. And maybe, just maybe, the forest's greatest language is not its warnings or its trades, but its quiet, patient insistence on beginning again. The seasons speak. Have you ever noticed how a forest feels different depending on the time of year? Not just in color or temperature, but in mood, as if the trees themselves change the tone of their conversation with each season. If you could translate their language, what would spring sound like? Summer? And what about the quiet, frost-covered months of winter? The truth is, the forest's dialogue is never still. It's just that the topics shift. Season to season, the priorities change, the messages change, even the rhythms of communication change. It's like a year-long symphony, with each movement carrying its own tempo and theme. Let's start in spring. This is when the forest wakes, stretching after months of slow, careful living. Bud tips swell, sap flows, and chemical signals race through the network underground. It's time. Roots push deeper, reaching for the fresh moisture left by melting snow or spring rains. Leaves unfurl, and the forest begins exchanging sugars and nutrients at a faster pace. Do you think the trees feel a kind of excitement in this season? We can't know, of course, but there's something undeniably energetic about the way everything leaps into growth. Above ground, the air itself becomes a messenger. Flowers release sweet scents to summon pollinators, while early leafing species provide the first meals for insects, which in turn feed birds returning from migration. It's a bustling time, a season of introductions and invitations. Spring is the forest clearing its throat after the hush of winter, speaking in bright, urgent notes. By the time summer arrives, the forest's tone changes. It's less about starting and more about sustaining. The canopy is thick now, leaves casting shifting patterns of shade below. The tree's conversation becomes about balance. How to manage water in the heat, how to keep up the steady exchange of resources without overtaxing themselves. Have you noticed how a summer forest hums? Not in words, but in the constant buzz of life. Bees in the flowers, wind through the leaves, the creak of branches in the warmth. I sometimes imagine this as the forest's steady work voice. Calm, measured, keeping everything in order. Summer is also the time of quiet collaborations. Trees feed their fungal partners generously, knowing they'll need them in the months ahead. They send sugars to shaded saplings, keep watch for pests, and maintain the chemical defenses they built in spring. It's a season of holding steady, But beneath the surface, the planning for what's next has already begun. Then comes autumn, and the forest shifts again. The days shorten, the sun tilts lower, and the trees begin an extraordinary act of letting go. They stop producing chlorophyll, revealing the reds, oranges, and golds that were hidden all along. Why? Partly to conserve energy for winter. Partly because those colorful pigments can help protect leaves from sun damage during the last weeks of nutrient reabsorption. It's a farewell performance, but not just for show. It's practical, efficient, and quietly beautiful. Do you think the forest feels a kind of relief in autumn? After months of constant growth and work, it begins to release its burdens, dropping leaves, slowing metabolism, sending sugars down into the roots for storage. Underground, the fungal network is still busy, moving the last of the season's nutrients between trees. It's as if the forest is packing for a long journey, making sure everyone has what they need before the deep sleep begins. And then winter. To us, it can feel like the forest has gone silent. The air is still, the branches bare, the earth frozen. But if you could listen in, you'd hear the slowest, softest version of the forest's language. Trees reduce their activity to a minimum, conserving energy. The network underground still functions, but it's quieter, like whispers in a library. Winter is the season of patience. There's no rushing here, no unnecessary movement. The forest holds its breath, waiting for the return of light and warmth. Do you think the trees dream in winter? Not in pictures like we do, but perhaps in a slow awareness of time passing, in the quiet memory of seasons before. It's easy to think of winter as an ending, but in truth, it's part of the preparation for everything to come. Without this rest, the bursts of spring growth wouldn't be possible. It's the pause that gives meaning to the music. When you look at the year as a whole, the forest's language feels almost like a conversation with itself. Asking in spring, who's ready? In summer, are we balanced? In autumn, have we stored enough? And in winter, rest now. The work will return. Each season teaches the forest something different. Spring teaches eagerness. Summer teaches balance. Autumn teaches release. Winter teaches patience. And each lesson is carried forward, woven into the tree's collective memory, shared through the roots and the air. I sometimes wonder, if you spent an entire year in the same forest, visiting every single day, would you begin to hear these seasonal shifts more clearly? Would you start to recognize the subtle change in the way the wind sounds in the leaves, or how the scent of the air changes when the first frost is near? Maybe the forest's language is something you can only learn by staying long enough to hear the whole cycle. Next time you walk under trees, take a moment to ask yourself, what season is the forest speaking in today? What's the tone? What's the topic? And if you stay long enough, will you catch the moment it changes? Because the forest is never truly silent. It's only ever between sentences. Dialects of the world's forests. Do all trees speak the same language? It's a tempting idea, isn't it, that somewhere beneath the soil, a birch in Canada could trade a message with a fig tree in Brazil, as if they all shared one universal tongue. But the truth is more complex. Like human languages, the speech of trees has regional accents, local slang, even entire dialects shaped by climate, soil, and the company they keep. So what does a forest in the tropics say to itself that a boreal forest might not? And is there anything all trees, everywhere, have in common? Let's begin in the tropics, a place where the forest hums with constant life. Here, there's no long winter to slow things down, no yearly pause for rest. Trees in tropical rainforests speak in rapid, ongoing exchanges, their messages shaped by abundance and competition. The soil, surprisingly, isn't rich. Nutrients are recycled so quickly that anything fallen is devoured by fungi and insects in days. So trees here depend heavily on their fungal partners, constantly trading sugars for precious minerals. Do you think that pace changes the tone of their language? Perhaps the messages are short and frequent, more like quick texts than long letters. In the Amazon, some species have evolved chemical signals tuned to the incredible diversity of their neighbors. Instead of sending a generic pest alert, they tailor their message to the specific insect or pathogen, almost like calling the right emergency number for the job. It's precise, efficient, and necessary in a place where hundreds of tree species might share a single square kilometer. Then there are the temperate forests like those in parts of North America and Europe. These are forests of rhythm and season, where the language shifts dramatically over the year. Trees here speak in cycles. Springtime's rush of resource sharing, summer's steady maintenance, autumn's preparation, and winter's slow, minimal whisper. The fungal networks here might go nearly dormant in the cold, only to surge with activity as the ground warms again. Do you think that makes temperate trees more reflective? Perhaps their language has longer pauses, more seasonal punctuation. The forest here is a storyteller with chapters, rather than a continuous stream. Move north into the boreal forests, and the conversation slows even further. Long, harsh winters mean that trees, often conifers like spruce and pine, must be incredibly efficient. The growing season may last only a few months, so messages are carefully timed. A warning about pests, for instance, has to be acted on quickly, because there's no time to waste before the cold returns. These trees are also masters of endurance. Their dialect might be spare, stripped of anything unnecessary, every signal carrying only what's essential. It's a language of survival, honed by centuries of frost. And then there are the dry forests and savannas, where water is the rarest currency. Here, trees may speak more about water than anything else, sharing it in times of scarcity or, in more competitive moments, hoarding it. Roots reach deep, sometimes tapping underground aquifers, and the fungal networks here must adapt to long periods of dryness. Do you think drought changes the emotional weight of the forest's conversation? If such a thing could be said, maybe it makes the messages more urgent, more deliberate. A whisper here might be worth more than a shout elsewhere. One of my favorite examples of a regional dialect comes from the coastal redwood forests of California. These giants, some of the tallest living beings on Earth, often share fog-drip water through their roots and networks. Fog is so important here that it becomes part of the language, trees adjusting their water exchange patterns not just with rainfall, but with the arrival of moist air rolling in from the ocean. It's a form of communication shaped directly by the landscape. Would a desert tree understand such a message? Perhaps not. It's like trying to explain snow to someone who's only ever lived in the tropics. And yet, despite these differences, there's a shared grammar among trees everywhere. Nutrients are traded for sugars. Chemical warnings alert neighbors to danger. Fungal threads serve as translators and couriers. It's as if all forests speak variations of the same ancient tongue, adapted over millions of years to fit their unique circumstances. I sometimes think of it like music. A rainforest might be a quick, layered jazz improvisation. Fast-paced, complex, everyone playing at once. A temperate forest is more like a symphony, with slow movements and swelling crescendos. A boreal forest is a minimalist piece, spare, deliberate notes in the cold. And a savanna? Perhaps a drumbeat, steady and grounding, each note spaced to conserve energy. But here's the question. Can forests of different dialects learn from one another? When we transplant a species from one climate to another, does it bring its language with it? Or does it learn the new dialect of its neighbors? Some studies suggest that transplanted trees can eventually connect to local fungal networks, but their effectiveness at communication may vary. It's like moving to a new country. You can learn the basics quickly, but fluency takes time. And what about global change? Climate shifts, human development, and habitat loss are altering the environments in which these languages evolved. What happens when a forest dialect is forced to change faster than it can adapt? Do the networks break down? Do some messages get lost in translation? Or do trees find new ways to speak, weaving hybrid dialects that suit the changing world? There's a haunting example in some fragmented forests, where old-growth sections are surrounded by farmland or urban areas. The physical connections between trees are cut, and the conversation can't flow as it once did. It's like silencing a choir mid-song. The surviving patches still speak, but the richness is diminished. Fewer voices, fewer harmonies. Do they remember the old chorus? Or have they adjusted to their smaller, quieter gatherings? It's not all lost, though. In some cases, human action has brought distant dialects together. Tree planting efforts often mix species from different regions, and over time, they may form networks that blend their signals. Imagine a forest where a tropical species shares a fungal partner with a temperate native, two dialects overlapping, finding common ground. Could that create entirely new words in the language of trees? I find it comforting to think that, despite their differences, forests across the planet are united by the same fundamental purpose: to sustain life, to adapt, to endure. Their languages may differ in pace, tone, and emphasis, but the intent is always the same. In that way, perhaps they're more connected than we realize. Next time you travel, or even just read about a distant forest, try to imagine the dialect it speaks. What does urgency sound like in a place where rain falls every day? What does patience sound like in a land where snow buries the ground for half the year? And if you stood in the middle of either, could you feel the difference in the air, even without understanding a word? It makes me wonder if the real secret in the secret language of trees is not that they communicate at all, but that they do so in ways perfectly tuned to where they are. Every root, every leaf, every signal is shaped by the place it calls home. And yet, no matter where you go, you can sense the same undercurrent. The forest is alive, the forest is listening, the forest is speaking. Perhaps that's the most universal part of all. Listening back. We've walked a long way together, haven't we? From roots hidden deep in the earth to leaves catching sunlight high above. From whispers of chemical messages to the vast fungal highways beneath our feet. From the quiet patience of winter to the rapid conversations of spring. And now, at the edge of this journey, I can't help but ask, after everything we've learned, what do you hear when you walk into a forest? Do you still hear silence? Or do you sense, somewhere in the stillness, that you've been invited into a conversation that's been going on for millions of years? We began with the idea that trees are not solitary, that they speak, not in words but in scents, in sugars, in subtle shifts of chemistry. And along the way, we've seen how they warn each other, feed each other, even nurture the next generation. But perhaps the most surprising discovery is that their language is not just about survival. It's about relationship. Think of all the forms that relationship has taken, the underground network that binds them together like the wiring of an ancient city, the scents that drift on the air, carrying news and invitations, the partnerships with birds, insects, mammals, even us, and the ability to adapt, to remember, to heal. It makes me wonder, if you could translate the forest's language perfectly, what would you find? Would it be full of drama and urgency, or more like an old friend's gentle check-ins? Would you hear gossip about the weather, or stories from centuries past? Or would you find that the forest doesn't distinguish between important and unimportant at all? That every detail is simply part of the whole? Here's the thing. I don't think the forest is waiting for us to become fluent. It's not holding back secrets until we earn them. It's speaking all the time, in all directions, whether or not we understand. The real question is, how much are we willing to listen? Listening, after all, is not something we humans are always good at. We prefer talking. We like answers. The forest offers neither in the way we expect. Its answers come slowly, spread across seasons, disguised as shifts in color, scent, or texture. To listen to a forest, you have to slow yourself down until your pace matches its own. What would happen if you tried that? If you walked not to reach the other side, but simply to be among the trees long enough for your mind to grow quiet? Would you notice the way the air changes when you move from sunlight into shade? Would you spot the tiny sapling hiding in the shadow of its mother? Would you realize that the smell you've been breathing in is not just forest smell, but a mix of hundreds of chemical notes, some meant for other plants, some meant for insects, and perhaps some meant for no one in particular? I sometimes think that the forest's greatest act of communication is not in sending us messages, but in showing us how to pay attention. Because when you begin to pay attention to the slow, layered conversations of trees, you start to notice other things, too. The way clouds move, the way birds change their calls at different times of day, the way light turns gold in the last hour before sunset. The forest's language, in other words, is an entry point into the language of the world. And yes, we now have science to back much of this up. We can measure nutrient flows, track chemical signals, and map fungal networks. We can prove that mother trees exist, that they feed seedlings, that they recognize kin. We can analyze the scents released by a tree under attack and watch as neighboring trees boost their defenses. But here's a question. Does understanding the mechanism mean we've understood the meaning? When we say a tree warns its neighbor, are we describing intention, or simply an evolved response that happens to benefit others? When a tree shares water, is it acting out of generosity, or because the network itself has no way to act selfishly? And does it matter? If the effect is survival, if the forest as a whole is stronger because of it, perhaps intention is a human concern, not a tree's. In the end, what the forest offers us is not just information, but perspective. It shows us that survival is rarely a solo act, that even in competition, there is connection, that every life is linked to others in ways we can't always see. And maybe, if we're willing to admit it, it reminds us that we, too, are part of that network. We breathe what the trees exhale. They breathe what we exhale. We depend on their shade, their food, their ability to anchor the soil. And in return, well, perhaps we owe them more than we've been giving. It's tempting to think of ourselves as caretakers of the forest, but maybe it's more accurate to see ourselves as participants. Members of a community that happens to include mosses and maples, fungi and foxes, woodpeckers and willows. The secret language of trees is not a code we crack once and for all. It's a conversation we enter into over and over each time we step among them. And here's a comforting thought. You don't need a PhD in botany or a microscope to begin. You only need time. Time to walk slowly, to notice patterns, to smell the air, to feel the bark beneath your hand, to ask questions even if you don't expect answers, to sit quietly enough that the forest begins to forget you're there, and you begin to remember that you're part of it. So, when you next find yourself in a forest, maybe try this. Stand still. Close your eyes. Listen. Not just for birds or wind, but for the subtle feeling that everything around you is in conversation. You may not understand the words, but you can sense the presence. The way the roots are touching, the way the light is shifting, the way the air carries 1,000 quiet messages from one being to another. If you stay long enough, you might realize something. The forest has been listening to you, too. To the vibration of your steps, the carbon in your breath, the warmth of your body as you pass. You're not just an observer, you're part of the story being told. And perhaps that's the best ending to our journey. Not that we've learned every secret, but that we've learned how to keep asking, how to stay curious, how to keep listening, how to move through the world knowing that it's alive in ways we can barely imagine. Because if the trees have been speaking for all this time, and we're only now beginning to hear them, just think what else might be waiting patiently for us to notice. So I'll leave you with one last question. When you walk away from the forest, does it miss you? Not in the human sense with longing and memory, but in the way it notices the absence of your footsteps, the change in the air, the slight difference in the pattern of the day. And if it does, what might it be saying to welcome you back next time? Whatever the answer, I hope you go and find out. Not once, not twice, but as often as you can. Because the conversation is still going on. It always will be.